welcome. Thanks for joining this 30-minute session looking at archive migration to Office 365 and how to simplify your project. My name is Laura Hill. I'm part of the migration team here at Essential. I get involved in helping organisations to scope out their requirements for archive migration. I'm joined today by my colleague Luke Cotton, who does the same, and he's going to provide a demonstration of how to simplify your migration using Transport Sprint software. So we're going to have a Q&A session at the end, so if any questions come to mind as we go through, just pop them into the questions box and our team are monitoring that. So this webinar is going to cover 3 challenges to be aware of when you're migrating an on-premise archive, like Semantic Enterprise Vault or Xanta's EAS, for example, into Office 365. So by the end of this half hour, the aim is to leave you with some relevant food for thought, I guess, to go back and discuss with your project team and perhaps incorporate into your migration strategy. Plus, you'll have an introduction to a migration tool that can help simplify the actual processing work involved. So we're coming at this from a background in email archiving and migration. We're quite a specialist company. Our team have spent the last 5-6 years delivering archive migrations for a wide range of organisations. So from very quick half a terabyte extractions to much larger scale global migrations for clients with perhaps more complex requirements. So today we're going to look at the sequence of events when migrating to Office 365. So what comes first, the mailbox or the archive? We're then going to move into things to be aware of just to ease the end user experience during your project and follow that up by some tips on making your migration as efficient as possible. So what does your project need? So archive migrations in one organisation, they probably don't happen that often. Because they don't happen that often, you might not have a huge amount of in-house knowledge about migrating an archive or even about your archive itself. The people who initially chose your archiving product might have disappeared a long time ago. So our advice really is to start by doing some groundwork and define your project priorities before you decide on a migration process or before you even start looking at migration software really or any suppliers to help you. So your priorities might be as simple as hitting a deadline. So for example, WH Smith migrated from the Quest archive into Office 365 last year, and their priority was getting things completed very quickly before a Christmas change freeze came into play. So you might, on the other hand, be very compliance driven, so you might be under pressure to account for every single message that you've migrated. Or your priorities might lie more with the user experience. So, for example, Kingston University, they took lots of steps to make sure that the migration was invisible to end users and to minimize calls to the help desk. So once you've prioritised what's important, you'll then start to look at how to meet those objectives, which brings us to these kind of 3 areas of focus for this webinar, so starting with your sequence of events. So by sequence of events, we mean kind of how you're going to weave your archive migration into your overall transition to Exchange Online. So you'll probably have your mailbox migration strategy in mind, be that your cutover approach, your staged approach. But when it comes to your archived emails, you'll need to bear in mind a few things. So you need to bear in mind that your target mailboxes need to exist in Office 365 before you migrate your archive. So that sounds pretty obvious, but unless you've got a hybrid configuration going on, you can only have your mailbox, your user's mailbox, in one place at one time. So it's either on the premise or it's in the cloud. So you're going to need to manage the timing of things for your archive migration. Second thing to be aware of course, is that archive migrations go quite a bit slower than mailbox migrations. And thirdly, you're going to need to bear in mind that you probably won't want users to be without access to their archived email for very long. So as an example, I'm going to illustrate one of the most common approaches that we see where your mailbox migration goes ahead of your archive migration. So in this scenario, you'll go live with Office 365 and you'll perform your mailbox migration. So your mailboxes will get migrated, including all of those full messages and including your archive shortcuts illustrated in green here. So these the little pointers to messages back in your on-premise archive. So users will continue to use these shortcuts from Office 365 to retrieve messages from your old archive. So you're basically coexisting your old archive and Office 365 for a period of time whilst you get the archive migration complete. So that period of time, it might be as short as a day, a week, a month, whatever timeline ends up working out for your project. And then gradually you perform your archive migration, so populating the mailboxes in Office 365 with that old archive data and removing the shortcuts at the appropriate time. So the benefit of doing things this way around is that you get your quick win, you get users onto Office 365 and they start seeing all the benefits of the cloud, and then you get to take your archive migration at a bit more of a steady pace to kind of trickle feeding the data into Office 365 and managing all the user communications around that. The downside, of course, is that it relies on those shortcuts working in Office 365. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, or sometimes you might have reasons why that's not particularly desirable. You'll want to test that out, of course. So this process, it might not be right for your project, and if not, you might have to completely abandon this notion of coexisting and make a completely clean break from your archive. And that will mean doing your mailbox migration and your archive migration perhaps in one hit. So it will probably mean that your email migration project as a whole has just got to go at the pace of your archive migration. So you'll be taking a batch of users, doing the mailbox move, and then doing the archive move pretty much at the same time. That said, if users can tolerate quite a while without access to their old archive, or if you give them a link to web access instead, or perhaps you are running an Exchange in hybrid mode, then you've probably got a few more options available to you. But hopefully that's helpful in painting a picture to a common sequence of events that we see. So now kind of within that context we can start thinking about what that means for a user perspective. So before deciding on your approach, it's certainly worth looking into the options available to you as to where you can migrate your archive data to within Office 365. So you might want to take a sort of basic restoration approach, so effectively taking all the messages belonging to a user in your archive and putting them in their mailbox. Or you might prefer what's kind of more of a rehydration approach, I suppose, looking at the archive shortcuts in a user's mailbox and just restoring those messages that exist as shortcuts. You might want to be a little bit smarter about things though. Certainly with a product like Transvault, you've got quite a few options. So you may only be provisioning users with primary mailboxes in Office 365. So that means you'll be targeting those primary mailboxes with your old archived emails. But if you're providing the in-place archive facility, so this secondary mailbox, you might prefer for your old archive data to be moved directly into there. Or you might even want a combination of the two. So you might want emails older than, I don't know, 12 months going into the secondary mailbox, newer emails going into the primary. You could also choose to maybe segregate that data that's come from your old archive, keep it very separate and create a separate folder called Old Archive or whatever you wanted to call it. Of course, you could do different things for different user groups. We've got customers who've, making arrangements for completely different license plans within 365 for different user groups, so you might need to be flexible around that. Other considerations really are whether you want to preserve that folder structure of email from your archive when you migrate and how you want to handle those shortcuts. So that's going to come down to how your archive is handling these things at the moment and how your users are interacting with your archive. So to help present a few things to consider, we've loosely categorized users into four main camps as to sort of how they manage their mailbox and therefore how they're interacting with your archive at the moment. So we've called these filers, sharers, searchers and deleters. So we'll just go through these four now. So we'll start with filers. I'm certainly one of these people. So these folk have got super organized mailboxes. They file messages away into a specific folder structure. So they're going to get pretty upset if your archive migration undoes all of that filing work. So you're going to want to take steps here to make sure that their folder structure is preserved. So if your archive database isn't keeping track of messages and these shortcut locations, you're going to have to accommodate this. So you're going to have to perhaps run some extra shortcut synchronization tasks before you migrate, or use migration software that gives you a lot more intelligence around shortcut locations. Next up is sharers. So this category relates to users that enjoy using shared mailboxes and public folders. So some of these shared mailboxes or public folders, they might not be subject to any archiving policy themselves. So your archive might not know anything about them, but users have still been happily dragging these little archive shortcuts into these areas. So if you don't deal with the situation, you'll end up with potentially a whole load of redundant shortcuts when you move these mailboxes into Office 365 and you decommission your old on-premise archive. Our third group is searchers. And one of our customers was a classic case in point for this last week, where they didn't think anyone used the search feature from their archive, so they assumed they could just limit their migration to items where a shortcut existed in the mailbox and they left everything else behind. But unfortunately, you soon knew about it when a small but, shall we say, high-profile group of users realized they couldn't access their old email following the migration. So this group of users had been merrily deleting these shortcuts, accessing their archives via search, so the project team had to make a quick change of plan and make an exception for this group of users and go back and migrate everything for them. Our final group to be aware of are deleters, who are probably welcome folk in your organisation. They're proactively chucking out email that they don't think they need anymore. But it's just to be aware that if users are deleting items and you're not actually purging those items out of your archive, then your migration, if you take everything, might end up deluging their mailbox with emails that they consider should no longer exist. So in this situation, if you can't be sure what's been going on there, you might want to migrate data in kind of two tranches. So you might want to put items where a shortcut exists into the primary mailbox, everything else into a separate folder, or the secondary mailbox. So at least you've migrated everything as part of your project, but you haven't cluttered up their mailbox. So if you're not quite sure what you're dealing with in terms of these user groups, it's worth checking those archive policies you've got in place, checking what features you've got rolled out, what client functionality you've got rolled out, maybe using some auditing in your archive to track activity for a little while if you've got that feature available to you, and of course, running a testing phase, running a pilot or something like that. Our final consideration for today is migration speed, and this is the #1 question that we get asked. How long is it going to take? Normally we can give a pretty good estimate based on averages that we see, but it's always worth knowing a bit about where bottlenecks might be within your project. So the basic premise here is that your migration software should never be your bottleneck. So you're going to be paying money for it, you're going to be selling servers for it, you're going to be relying on it to get the best possible performance out of your archive and the best possible throughput into Office 365. So we don't have a huge amount of time today to go into much detail, but if speed is important for your project, then there's certainly a few things that you can look out for. So if we start looking at the destination side of things, so looking at Office 365, so at the moment getting data into Office 365 means going via Microsoft approved protocols with potential, we've heard for kind of this drive shipping to come at some point in the future, but for now going via these specific protocols means that you're going to be subject to throttling from Microsoft, so there is going to be a limit on the pace of your ingestion into Office 365. So that's where it becomes helpful to use migration software that means that you can spin up multiple servers for your migration. So then you can run multiple tasks, which in themselves means multiple processing threads. So normally it's just a case of being able to stand up a couple of virtual machines, so we're not talking a huge infrastructure overhead for this kind of temporary migration, but it could halve your migration time if you've just got 2 servers running. You'll also want to use software that uses impersonation to get around the connection into Office 365 being limited to a single admin account. So it's basically sort of impersonating multiple users to optimize input into 365. You might also benefit from how your migration software is batching up data when it passes it to Office 365. So this concept basically being like the postman delivering a whole stack of letters through your door in one bundle instead of posting them through one at a time. So I said we don't have a huge amount of time to look into the detail here, and it's a whole webinar in itself really talking about this, the wizardry around optimizing throughput into Office 365. But the point I'm trying to make is that if speed's important, it's worth looking at whether your migration software is doing lots of things behind the scenes to help you, like multiple servers, tasks, threads, user accounts, batching, this kind of thing. So that's the destination. Now just a few points on optimizing how quickly data comes out of your source, your on-premise archive. So this might actually be just as important as any throughput rate into Office 365, because you might actually be mindful that your archive is creaking a little bit, or you've got some serious constraints to do with your on-premise infrastructure. So if your source archive is not in good health, or it's heavily used throughout the day, or you literally cannot stop archiving because that would bring your Exchange servers to their knees, then our advice to you is really don't make your archive work too hard during your migration. So that normally means thinking about how your migration software is interacting with your archive as it migrates. So archive migration software, it typically falls into 2 categories, so ones that connect directly to your archive and ones that connect via the API. So by direct, we mean your migration software sits in the middle and it connects directly into the archive database and your storage, and it extracts the data directly from there. So it completely bypasses your archive servers, those servers responsible for your day-to-day stuff, your archiving, your retrieval, your search, your indexing, that kind of thing. By the API approach, we mean the migration software gets to your data via the official vendor's API, so it's using native message retrieval processes to go and fetch the data from your archive stores and migrate it. So direct approach can be really handy for speed and to accommodate poor network links. Most of our migrations, I'd say, do take this approach. So to give an example, we're working with a construction company at the moment. They've got 3 instances of Semantic Enterprise Vault to migrate, but their network links are really slow, too slow to make it viable to migrate. So they've taken a copy of the EV databases, taken a copy of the Vault stores, and they've remounted them in the main data center where the speeds are a lot better, and they're migrating the content to Office 365 from there. So this direct approach will enable you to do things like that. Having said that, being able to migrate via the API can be equally helpful if you need to extract from certain storage types, or I don't know, you've got an archive that's been through lots of version upgrades or has got a bit of a troublesome past and you're experiencing some issues with certain messages. Our experience really is that there's times when you'll want to go direct, there's times when you want to use an API even within the same project. So that's certainly the reason why Transvault offers a hybrid connector, so you can switch between the 2 approaches there. The final point here is to look for an application that gives you the ability to schedule your migration, so to ramp up that activity out of hours or over the weekends, which will help you generally speed things up. So hopefully that's been useful, some pointers about what to consider when you're preparing for your archive migration. Feel free to keep on asking any questions via the comments box. And now I'm going to hand over to Luke to show you how the Transvault Sprint application specifically allows you to execute the migration.
Lovely, thanks very much, Laura. So we've heard of some of the pitfalls and some of the many considerations to make when you're migrating an archive up to Office 365. And I want to expand on a couple of those points and show you a few more. And I'm going to be using Transvault Sprint software to help demonstrate that. So in front of us here we have the main Sprint dashboard. Now Sprint is the latest tool from Transvault software, and the whole idea of it is to simplify the process, reduce a lot of the complexity with some predefined kind of out-of-the-box settings, and as we step through the process, it's going to ensure that everything is set up correctly as we go. So there's no point following Laura's advice here and planning everything to perfection, only to add risk to your project through unintuitive software. So I've pre-populated some of this information here, so I'm not going to take us through every single step this afternoon, but I do want to focus on a couple of key areas of consideration for you, and I'll be using Sprint to help demonstrate that. So as I go ahead and configure a new connection here, and obviously we'll head into Exchange or Office 365, we'll use Windows Authentication. So you simply input your Office 365 tenant destination and some admin details into here. And this brings us on to the alternative output. Now, certain message classes or messages over 50 megabytes in size can't be migrated to Office 365 via Microsoft's EWS connector. They simply don't allow it. But presumably you don't want to leave this data behind in your old archive, so what do you want to do with it? So Sprint will record which messages are rejected by the Office 365 connector, and it'll automatically push these out to an alternative output. So in this particular case, we have PST files where we can specify the path and the maximum size, and this will ensure that all the messages that you want to take out of your archive will be migrated up to 365 eventually, whether you do that directly or via PST file, but you're certainly not being dictated by Microsoft's EWS connector. For the purpose of today, I won't use this particular output, but this will bring us on to the shortcut synchronization that Laura touched upon earlier. Now, as we heard, that different users interact with their archives in different ways. Some will be using the search tool, and the vast majority will have stubs in their mailbox. So what we're doing here is we're configuring Sprint to point towards your existing on-premise Exchange servers, and it will scan the user mailbox and note which messages have the stubs. It's a really important feature to have because it will allow you to handle your stubbed or your non-stubbed messages in very different ways, and that's going to allow you to ensure a seamless transition into Office 365, which we'll talk about later. I'm going to skip the configuration to LDAP for Active Directory, and we'll just go into the analysis phase, which will basically have a look at our Enterprise Vault and return some information. So we have a couple of Vault stores, we have a few thousand user archives, we have a journal, we've got a couple of public folders which has just been alerted to us here because they can be a little bit tricky when going into 365, but all in all we can see that we've captured all the information that we want from our archive. So the next step would just be to match the user archives from Enterprise Vault against the Active Directory, and you can see here that the majority of these have matched up fine. If you do have someone that might have changed name or got married or hasn't quite matched up, you have the ability to do that manually, or you can do that by multiple exporting out to CSV file and doing it that way. A few important considerations to make when actually planning the batching and the individual tasks. So here I've created a batch which is called batch 1, and you'll notice here that I have the option to migrate the messages and delete the shortcuts in one fell swoop, or I might choose just to migrate the messages over the time being and run this as a separate task at a later date to remove those shortcuts if needs be. We've got the retrieval method here that Laura's talked about, so we don't need to pick between direct and API. We're going to use hybrid, and Sprint's going to intelligently decide which is the best retrieval method at any one time to give us maximum performance. We can pick between user archives and journal mailboxes. Journaling into 365 is an entirely separate webinar altogether, so we'll leave that well alone for the time being. And we can also pick where we migrate the source data to. Now, this is an incredibly powerful feature when combined with the shortcut synchronization ability that you saw earlier, and it will allow you to get your data to 365 in a manner that's completely transparent to users. So, for example, whilst your mailbox is still on-prem, you may want to pre-populate, if you have your E3 365 licenses, you may choose to pre-populate the in-place archive with all of the non-stub data in EV. So this is data that doesn't appear in a user's mailbox. And then when you're ready to move the primary mailboxes up to the cloud, just simply have Sprint replace those message stubs with the full message for complete and utter user transparency. So we can filter by various different AD groups, but here we're basically selecting which users we want to add into the batch. So I'll stick them all in. And we've got the option here to define a date range if we want, and we can also pick whether we migrate only the stubbed messages or everything from the user archive. Once I've come onto the processing options, I have a few options here with regards to different audit levels if you particularly have a compliant regulation, and we can change the number of processing threads, which I'll talk about in a second. We'll save the settings and we're almost ready to kick off a batch. We've got a brief synopsis of what's going to be achieved here, and all we'll do is we'll simply drag and drop this over to begin the migration. I'm going to jump straight to this performance tab, and you can see here we have the volume of data in the source archive. We have the messages, the megabytes per second that we have in terms of a retrieval thread. We have our 20 processing threads and the amount of data in Office 365. And you can obviously see this is being pushed through. An important thing that Sprint's doing here is it's determining that actually the bottleneck's at the destination in this particular example. So even though we're getting 40 messages per second, we may want to increase the number of processing threads just to help us speed up that migration. This summarizes the individual threads that we have. So we have analysis stage, the stub synchronization stage. Here we're migrating some messages, and of course we'll delete the shortcuts. We can see here the overall progress of things. So we have shortcut sync, we have the mailboxes that we've been able to migrate, a breakdown of the messages. So far we've migrated, we haven't skipped or failed any messages at this particular point. And it's important to note here the retrieval hybrid. So if we had a tool that was only, just accessing via the API, then we would have we wouldn't have had the performance benefit of around 66% of our migration to use the direct connector. If we were only using the direct connector, then we would have seen probably about 9 million messages fail. So the beauty of Sprint here, of course, is it's using its hybrid connector. We have the benefit of both, although we do still have a very small amount of failed messages, which you'd expect to see. But 1% or less is entirely acceptable. And that's about everything I wanted to run through this afternoon. I hope that's been useful for you and give you an insight into just how simple the migration process can be. Have we had any questions come in at all, Laura?
So first one here says, what if we're running hybrid? No, it doesn't. It says, what if we're not running hybrid in hybrid mode and we can't stop archiving? So I think perhaps what the person's looking at here is this sequence of events. So where they're not running in hybrid, so it's not a case of pre-populating any mailboxes in Office 365, but it's a case of that timeline, but you can't stop archiving. Perhaps you've got very aggressive archiving policies to keep mailbox sizes as minimal as possible. So yeah, I'll kind of, in answer to that, it will be a case of mapping that timeline and that sequence of events as to when you're doing your mailbox migration. But if you're going to need at some point to take a complete copy of your archive, you will need to draw a line in the sand and call your archive static at some point in order to do your migration. So in that scenario, but if you literally need to keep on archiving, what we'd probably suggest is that you choose an appropriate point in time, apply a date filter to that migration so that you can progress with your archive migration. Make sure you're taking all the data with you, but actually your archiving solution just keeps on ticking over in the background just to alleviate any issues with Exchange and mailbox growth. Of course, there might be a scenario where you need to do a sort of delta migration as well. So say if you were taking your archive, migrating from an offline copy of your archive, taking this sort of direct approach, and if your network links weren't up for it, you might decide, right, we'll take a copy of the archive offline and we'll migrate it from there. It might be that you need to incorporate a sort of delta migration process in that. But I suppose the key is mapping out this timeline and figuring out the appropriate filters to use, but also your migration software, and certainly something like Transvault, as you can see from those reports that Luke showed, it knows what's been migrated. So having sort of full reports as to what messages have been migrated when, and this control over filters and policies will be helpful in that scenario. Another question here, we've got source 1, can Sprint migrate it? So source 1 being the EMC archive. Can Sprint migrate it, Luke?
Yeah, it's a very good question. The short answer is Sprint can't migrate it at the moment. So this Sprint is designed at the moment. It supports Enterprise Vault. There is an EAS connector that's coming next month. If you have some other archives, then really be looking at something like Migrator, which is the kind of flagship archive migration tool that can do all your sorts of your HP RISs and your IAPs and your some of the other sort of weird and wonderful archives. If you're looking to move out of those, then that's something that's something for Migrator. So I want to pick up on another question that we had is, what can we do with messages that fail? So we've had a case here that in the demo that there are 2,000 messages or so to import, and that's a great question, and that really kind of depends on exactly why those messages have failed. So if I just come back to our report screen here, in this particular example, the majority of these failures, so 250, 500, this is an archiving error. So without going away, I couldn't tell you specifically what error 218 was, but it's giving us a clue here. The resource has not been found. So this could be messages that are corrupt in the source archive. So the usual port of call would be to try and access a handful of these messages via the Enterprise Vault kind of admin tool, and the likelihood is they're probably corrupt, and there's not a huge amount that you can do with corrupt messages. And this is probably somewhere where, again, one of the reasons why you probably want to engage with a partner and have some professional services on hand, just to have someone kind of check over these types of things as well. But the likelihood is you will have corrupt messages in your archive. They've often been in situ for years. They might have gone through different upgrades, version releases. They may be out of support. So yeah, the short answer is it really depends on the individual error, but in this case, it's down to a corrupt source archive. I think that's, we're just conscious of time running over. So there are a few other questions. We will come back to you individually on those, but one thing we did just want to draw your attention to is our next webinar in the series. So we'll be talking about managing a hybrid Exchange and Office 365 environment. We have Exchange MVP Michael van Horenbeek joining us. and we have other webinars in the pipeline to getting journals into Office 365 as we touched upon. Do get in touch if that's going to be of interest. I think that's everything from the Essential team, so thank you so much for joining us, and we will circulate details shortly. Thanks now, bye-bye.